goes.
Hearing will come back to order, and apologize we were a few minutes later than we said. But Ms. Capps, Mr. Green is, at this time I recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Knoll, a couple of weeks ago, a colleague of mine, not on this committee, but Congressman Bustani, who is from South Louisiana, and I introduced a resolution that would that would try and have a committee hearing and get floor time on streamlining some of the concerns I know a lot of us have about the Department of Interior. The resolution requires streamlining review and appropriate approval of applications for shallow and deep water permits in the Outer Continental Shelf. 2, take immediate action to provide shallow water and deep water industry with a completed sample application which meets all the new safety and environmental regulations as a template, and provide written guidance and clarification to applicants regarding new safety requirements. And 4, provide permit applicants with timely and detailed explanations on any areas of the permit which do not satisfy the new requirements. Some of us in Congress are caught because whenever we say, well, you're not issuing whether shallow water or deep water, they say, well, we don't have a lot of permits that are available. But I'm also hearing that people aren't submitting them simply because they need to have some certainty on what they're doing. Is that the concern that we're hearing, that a lot of our shallow water drillers particularly, and I know maybe a lot of members, most of our shallow water is natural gas. If we could get oil out of it, we would be happy about it, but because oil is much more lucrative now. But so many of our shallow water drillers are actually natural gas producers.
Well, Congressman, you're not alone in having failed to obtain the level of transparency from the Department of Interior that is necessary to understand the true backlog of permits. We have asked for months, and in fact, members of this committee have asked in writing, and other members on a bipartisan basis have asked the Department of Interior to tell us one simple number. How many permits are pending? We've heard a number of different numbers. Secretary Salazar says one number, we say another. In fact, just recently in the INSCO litigation matter filed in the federal court in New Orleans, an affidavit was filed by a senior ranking member of the BOEM who said there's 270 pending shallow water permits. So this numbers game is a source of frustration for us, Congressman, and I think we owe, the American people are owed at least a true number of the backlog of actual permits. But I'll tell you this, there is demand to drill natural gas and oil wells in the shallow waters of America right now. According to the BOEM's own website, there's 20 permits that are pending. Scores of others would, in fact, as you noted, Congressman, be filed if the industry had some level of certainty as to how long those permit applications will take to be reviewed. When will they be issued? What will my liability requirements be? What level of certainty will I have that the federal government will back up their rhetoric with action and issue the permit? So I think the true numbers are yet to be known. And Congressman, I applaud you and Congressman Bustani for asking the question, because I think we deserve answers.
Once a permit's approved, how many days does it take for you to get your workers actually to back to work?
That's a great question. And Congressman, unfortunately, through the de facto moratorium that we've experienced since April, my company has kept many of its rigs idle. We've kept workers on the rigs, chipping, painting, doing busy work, catching up with paperwork, catching up with training, on the hopes and prayers that permits would be forthcoming. So many of our rigs that are idle are ready to go in a matter of weeks. But operators take sometimes weeks, if not months, to plan their operations ahead of time, which goes back to the dramatic lack of certainty is causing operators to just throw up their hands in frustration. Operators have to engineer the well. They have to secure caterers and cooks. They have to secure a drilling rig. It's an orchestrated process that takes time.
Okay.
But
I only have about 55 seconds left. Let me get to another question. So I know so you can't just turn on and turn it off. You have to actually have a plan. We wish it was assembly line, but you just can't roll that rig out and get it producing within a day or a week or even a month. Sometimes that would be awfully quick. Let me ask you, in your testimony, you talked about in recent months, governments like United Kingdom, Norway, and Australia have carefully examined the continued use of the same type of drilling equipment we use in the Gulf of Mexico. And each country concluded that the industry can drill safely and they're better off securing their own energy and reap for themselves significant economic gains of a healthy oil and gas industry. We're talking about Norway, United Kingdom, and Australia. And can you elaborate on the process these countries went through? Because they stood down after what happened in the Gulf of Mexico with Horizon, but they're back out producing right now, aren't they, in drilling?
That's right, and they issued no moratorium in the UK as an example. The UK, a very advanced technological place, they specifically considered whether a moratorium was necessary, and they concluded, just as President Obama should have concluded, is should we drill in our own waters, using our own labor, and reaping the economic benefits from that activity where we know we could drill safely, or should we export those jobs and export our energy security to places that are unstable or potentially hostile to their interests?
This time, recognize the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Scalise, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Really appreciated the opening statements that you all made, hitting on a number of different points. Mr. Noe, I want to start with some of the comments that you made. You started off talking about the bankruptcy of Seahawk, and here is a company, as you say, the second largest shallow water driller. You point out that 85% reduction that we've seen in shallow water drilling. Of course, this was a deep water disaster with the Macondo well. Presidents said many times there's no moratorium on shallow water drilling, yet, as you point out, there's an 85% reduction in shallow water drilling, not to mention what's going on in the OCS. And then you have this bankruptcy, and kind of riveting the testimony you gave about actually having to be there and seeing some of those employees who literally are losing their livelihoods, losing their careers, not because they did anything wrong, but because this administration has chosen to go down a path of shutting down an entire industry. And so if you can tell me, because obviously this is not just limited to the companies along the Gulf Coast, the high gas prices that people are paying obviously is one national impact, but also the companies that these companies in your coalition do business with. They buy pumps for these rigs that are made by Caterpillar in Illinois. If you can give me a little bit of the ripple effects that this has throughout the country, not just in South Louisiana with this radical policy.
Congressman, that's a great question. I think we need to understand very clearly that this economic tragedy is not limited to the borders of Louisiana and Texas, as you noted, Congressman. To give you one example, Hercules offshore, on each of our drilling rigs, we have 3 engines. Almost all of them are manufactured by Caterpillar, made in Illinois. We conducted a survey of just our members in the last couple of years, and the spend that we contribute outside of Louisiana and Texas is frankly staggering. $376 million came from the state of Illinois, far from the Gulf of Mexico. And that extends to states like Oklahoma, $125 million over a 3-year period of just this survey that we conducted. Colorado, $35 million. I mean, we buy each of our several thousand workers 2 pairs of Red Wing boots every year, made in Red Wing, Minnesota. The tentacles of the economic connection of the industry reach far beyond the Gulf South and will reach the home states of your constituents today.
And let me ask Mr. Adams to touch on that too, because I know you represent a large group of companies that work in the industry as well. What kind of ripples are you seeing?
Well, we're seeing a ripple effect across South Louisiana directly. Imagine being a shipyard owner or a shipyard worker. 2011, the market anticipated that deep water wells would move up to somewhere in the mid-40s from 33. There were plans for that. There were vessel orders made, and those contracts had to be pulled back. There was no work for the vessels that would be built. And then the ripple effect for building a vessel goes across the country, just as Mr. Noe said. We also are, our whole industry is about delivering goods and people out to the rigs, and that goes from groceries to all kinds of hardware supplies, and that's just shut down right now.
Yeah, and I know, Mr. Daniels, I share a lot of the concerns you have about tourism, seafood. In fact, I still love eating the great Gulf seafood that we have. We've been pushing the FDA to ramp up testing. I think right now Gulf seafood is probably the safest, most tested food in the world. because of this. I think the biggest frustration a lot of us have is that the people being punished aren't the people who actually created this disaster. BP and their negligence, they cut the corners, and yet it's the companies that are represented at this table that had absolutely nothing to do with it, that have played by the rules, actually have a higher bar for safety. And yet you've got the president that's literally initiating a policy that's going after and shutting down an entire industry, and it's leading to higher gas prices. It's leading to thousands of job losses. And I think what's most irritating, you know, we've been trying to get a meeting with the president to talk specifically about this issue. I've got a letter I'd like to ask unanimous consent to enter into the record. Our delegation,
without objection,
all Republicans, all Democrats, back in June asked to meet with the president to talk specifically about this issue. I think what is most frustrating, not only have we not gotten a meeting, we haven't even gotten a response from the White House. This is the entire delegation talking about a policy that's led to thousands of jobs, and yet the president has time to go and do his brackets for the NCAA tournament. We know the president's bracket picks. We don't know his energy policy. The energy secretary yesterday sat here and said he can't tell us the president's planning to lower gas prices, but he's got time to let people know what his picks are for energy. I'd like to also ask unanimous consent to issue into the record. This is a letter 100 members of Congress signed to the president weeks ago asking him to let these people get back to work drilling safely. We still haven't gotten a response on this letter. It's time for the president to act. This is costing jobs, it's raising gas prices, and it's killing America's energy security.
Without
Thank you, and I
objection,
yield back.
this time the gentleman from Mr. Inslee is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Just for the record, I'd like to say, since our commander-in-chief was questioned about basketball, I would bet $1 he could beat the last gentleman in a game on 101. I'd like to see it, but we'll
Be happy to take him up on that. I'd like to meet with him to do that. If that's what I need to do to meet with him, I'll take him up on it.
I'll suggest
Challenge him in a day. Thank you, Mr. Hensley.
Well, he's taken me to the hoop, so he's a good ball player. I want to ask Dr. Mason some questions. And, Doctor, the reason I'm asking you this question is you have doctor in front of your name. That's why I'm asking you these questions. So if you went to the doctor and the doctor told you you had cancer, what would you do? Would you listen to him in general?
Depends on what kind of doctor.
Well, let's assume he was a good doctor. Let's assume he was a good doctor. Let's say he was a Nobel Prize-winning doctor. And let's say you had some questions about that diagnosis. So as a rational person, you went and got a second opinion. And that doctor told you you had cancer. Do you think you might pay attention to him?
Perhaps.
Okay, let's say that you had some questions about that doctor. So you went to 2,500 other doctors, and they all told you you had cancer. If that happened, would you then go to keep trying to find a doctor who said you didn't have cancer, or you think you might do something about it?
2,500 qualified doctors within their specialty field, perhaps.
So so you'll know, what this committee has found out is that there, at a minimum and a lot more, 2,500 qualified science doctors who have concluded that the Earth has a pathology, and that pathology is carbon dioxide pollution, which is radically changing its ecosystem to our detriment. Now, this committee voted essentially to ignore all of these doctors and sort of try to find some other doctors somewhere in the Earth that had some question about it, and have ignored all of the physicians of the Earth who've told us we got a problem. Now, from what you know about the science, and I'll give you a chance to voice your opinion now, do you think the state of these physicians of the Earth who've told us we got a problem, do you think we should listen to them and try to do something about this pathology we're experiencing, namely carbon pollution in the Earth?
I see no problem doing something about it. I'm not an environmental scientist or really feel qualified to opine in any expert capacity about the carbon's contribution to pollution. It's my personal belief that it certainly plays a role, however.
So your belief is, based on what you know of the science, that carbon pollution probably does play a role in some changes in the climate. Is that a fair statement?
I don't object to that statement, no.
Well, unfortunately, the Republican majority did, who voted en bloc on a continuing front on their war on science to deny all of these scientists yesterday, just so you'll know. I want to refer to some production numbers about oil production in the United States. Could we put the graphs up? The first graph I would refer the panel to is a chart showing U.S. domestic oil production, which sort of bottomed out in 2008. I think that was the year that President Obama took office, and has gone up in 2009. Excuse me, there's a different bar chart I think we have in a different order. Yeah, now we're looking at the right chart. You'll see the bottomed out at about 6.7 million barrels per day when President Obama was elected. Since then has been going up. Is at about 7.3 in 2009. It is about 7.5 in 2010. These are production numbers from the United States Energy Agency. Next slide, please. This slide shows Gulf of Mexico crude oil production, million barrels per month. You'll notice was going at about 40 million barrels per month pretty steadily from October 2006 to the Hurricane Gustav and Ike when it plunged in October 2008, came back fairly rapidly in the first few months of the Obama administration, and now has been in a relatively steady state with some ups and downs, about 5 million barrels per month production during the Obama presidency. Next slide, please. The next slide shows annual U.S. natural gas gross withdrawals. We'll see that you get over toward the right side, you see 2000 pretty steady, 2008 it has been going up fairly dramatically in the last 2 years, 2008, 2009, right to the right of the graph, you'll see that is going up. Now, from these slides, which are numbers, these are not, talking points. These are not propaganda. These are not political hack jobs. These are numbers. Now, from the numbers, it looks to me like the United States is experiencing an increase in domestic oil production, an increase in Gulf of Mexico, or at least a stable production in Gulf of Mexico, and a significant increase at a fairly rapid rate in natural gas production in the United States. And I just think it's important for us to look at the numbers. The numbers don't lie, and propaganda does. Thank you.
Congressman, could I add something to that? Could I answer that question?
Yes, sir.
I think it is a fundamental misunderstanding of the way the oil and gas industry works for the Obama administration to take credit for the increase in production. The increase in production that we've seen in the last couple of years are as the result of new oil coming online that was decades in the making, literally decades in the making and planning, just to name a few. And these are all major new finds that took years and sometimes decades to plan and bring online. In 2007, Independence Hub in Atlantis, 2008, Neptune, Blindface, Thunder Horse, 2009, Mirage, Tahiti, 2010, Telemark, Perdido. These took years of planning, and they were planned and executed under the apparatus of the prior administration. And the federal government's EIA has already stated itself that production has declined in 2010 and will continue to do so in 2011.
Well, that's really interesting because you were really happy to point out he shouldn't get any credit for this, but he should be responsible for everything else that happens in the world, including increasing gas prices, which is a result of demand increases from China and India. Thanks a lot for being fair to our Commander-in-Chief.
Mr. Griffith, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, if I could yield to the gentleman from Louisiana.
The gentleman yields 5 minutes to the gentleman from Louisiana.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Inslee's idea, I'll be happy to take him up if challenging the president to a game of one-on-one basketball gets me a meeting with him so we can talk about this crisis that's led to thousands of job losses and higher gas prices. I'll be happy to challenge the president to basketball. And frankly, I think I could take him in a game of one-on-one. I've seen him throw a baseball, so I'll be happy to offer up that challenge, and hopefully the president accepts, and then during the game we can talk about the fact that you've got thousands of people who have lost their job and cannot get a response from this administration, and this problem's getting worse. When you talked about, I think, Mr. Adams, you talked about the revenue losses. I think the second largest generator of federal revenue, next to income taxes, is the revenue paid by the oil and gas industry. I know a lot of people like to beat up on the oil and gas industry and act like they're not paying any taxes. The second largest generator of federal revenue is the oil and gas industry, primarily because of the leases, the bonus bids, the royalties, not only to the federal government, to state and local government. And with this with this attempt, or this not attempt, this policy by the president to shut down this industry, just what would that mean in terms of revenue? And I think you had some recent revenues of how much money the federal government collected on all of these various forms of payments from the oil and gas industry. Can you, Mr. Adams, touch further on that?
I believe my testimony, I had $1.4 billion in taxes directly from our segment. Maybe Mr. Noe could help me with the full royalties. I would like to make 2 points real quickly. Taking credit for last year's production is like the farmer asking the banker to give him credit based on last year's yield when he's failed to put in a crop this year. It just doesn't work. And the other part of this whole economic and jobs argument that I think needs to be appreciated is exploration is labor intensive. It's capital intensive. Production is production. The best production doesn't require intense labor or intense capital. And so that's why the vessels that serve these deepwater rigs, which are the hive, and our vessels are the bees of activity, that's why we are in an economic depression right now.
And Mr. Noe, did you want to also follow up on that?
Just to echo on what Mr. Adams said, is that the biggest benefactor, and really, if you think about it, the biggest oil company in the world and the biggest shareholder of any oil company in the world is the U.S. federal government. The U.S. federal government controls offshore leasing, and it, since 1982, has received over $200 billion from a variety of royalty payments, lease payments, et cetera. It's in the billions, of course, not just from leasing activity, but from bonuses paid for lease sales, which is important to note that this year, in 2011, will be the first year in 60 that we haven't had a lease sale. The Department of Interior has...
The first time since when? I'm sorry to interrupt you.
In the last 60 years.
We've had an
offshore lease sale for a generation. And
so I guess using the logic of the president, if he's going to try to take claim for production today that was authorized, explored years ago, I guess in a few years that means that a future president is going to have a big reduction in production. And I guess the president will blame that next president because of the policies that are being made today that are strangling this industry. Would that be an accurate statement?
That's accurate. And to respond to the congressman from Washington, this industry is purely supply and demand. He is absolutely correct that supply is on the increase, or demand is on the increase from places like India and China, who have recovered much faster from the recession than we had anticipated. And that increase in demand requires a barrel-for-barrel increase in production if you're going to keep prices flat. And what we've seen is a decline in production. So if demand goes up, just economics 101, demand goes up, supply goes down, make no mistake that prices will go up, and that's what we're experiencing now.
And historically, when you look through, this time of year during the winters, typically when gas prices are going down, the summers when they go up, and this is an historically high level of gas prices, not because of what's going on. In fact, the gas prices were rising well before the events in the Middle East and North Africa. It was because of the president's policies. And I want Dr. Mason and maybe Mr. Pugliese, is that correct? To comment on this, because you talked about not only the lost revenues but also the supply and demand issue, and in a policy, a federal policy shutting off production will actually lead to higher prices today. If y'all can finish with that, and then.
If I may, I just wanted to mention, I did talk about the lost tax revenues from the Gulf closure. Those I've estimated to be on the state and local level of about $155 million so far and counting. On the federal level, about $350 million. It's just very simple math. If people don't have incomes, they're not going to pay income taxes, and they're not going to spend income that they don't have to generate sales taxes. I'd also like to follow up on the analogy of the cancer. If the doctors wanted me to follow a course of treatment for my cancer that could cause another cancer, I would think twice about following that course of treatment, especially if the doctors were paid by the drug companies that were sponsoring that course of treatment. So there's a pure conflict of interest there. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. McKinley. See, I'm out of time.
This time I recognize the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Gardner, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today and spending time with us to share your expertise. Just a question for you, if I could start with, is it Mr. Pugliaresi? Very good. If I could start with you and just answer this question perhaps down the line. Do you believe the administration is doing enough to help lower gas prices by this summer?
No, absolutely not. I mean, of course, it's hard to know what expectations, how they may shift things. But if we had, as we say, if we had a very aggressive development program, if we had approved Keystone, if we had not denied the permit for Shell to drill on in the Beaufort Sea, we are creating a set of conditions out there in which it appears that we are unwilling to produce our own resources.
Dr. Mason?
Well, I think there are two things that can reduce gas prices. The one that people typically point to is increasing supply. So certainly if we had enough supply online, demand would adjust to supply and we'd see lower prices. The other thing, though, is reducing demand. And it strikes me that nobody's really talked much about what I think was a very good idea that the Republicans advanced a little while back about revisiting some old regulations and doing away with them. And one key regulation we still have on the books prohibits the production of high-mileage diesel automobiles in the U.S. because of old, stinky 1970s diesel, which is not even available in the U.S. anymore. We can have 65-mile-per-gallon cars right now with the stroke of a pen.
I want to get down through the rest of it, but could you send me information on the regulation you're referring to?
Yeah.
Thank you. Dr. Cooper.
The ability of the president or any other policymaker in Washington to affect the price of gasoline by the summer is quite limited. It's the long-term decisions that we make. I look on the demand side and see if we had actually adopted a 15-year program to double our gasoline mileage 15 years ago, we would have twice as much spare capacity in the world, and we'd be a lot better off. So in the short term, I think the short-term fixes are a mistake because they only make the long-term problem more difficult.
So do you think the Obama administration has a plan to deal with the increasing gas prices?
I think any administration that said they had a plan to deal with gasoline prices would be whistling in the wind, as every one of the past 7 presidents have been. President Bush was faced with constant ups and downs in gas prices, and he never had a plan. Jimmy Carter didn't have a plan. The simple fact of the matter is that the president's ability to affect the price of gas in a 30-day or 60-day or 90-day period is extremely limited. And it is a mistake to claim you can do things that you can't do. Now, it might be fun to blame them, depending on which side you're on, but the simple fact of the matter is that, and you've heard it here today, taking responsibility or throwing blame at presidents, especially over the short term, is just a political game. It has nothing to do with sensible policy.
Yes, sir. I believe the president's planned moratorium is raising gas prices and killing jobs.
Mr. Daniels?
Well, I'm just a small businessman, not an oil man, but I could tell you this: the only way the president or this government can control the price of gas is to socialize it, and heaven forbid that happen. That won't happen. So with that said, the only other way that he can control gas, you know, I've noticed something else when it comes to supply and demand, as in most businesses, as we do business at our peril. It used to be on the other end, supply and demand. Now, as a business, we demand as much as they could pay. And we're now dealing with the what I call the squeal factor. Unfortunately, we've graduated a few folks coming out of Harvard, maybe, who feel that, okay, they want to, we got to get everything done on time. Let's see, how is it? It is, we've got to have production above the expectations and completion.
Mr. Daniels, I'm sorry, I got to go. I've got to make sure we get to everybody. Mr. No?
Just one quick thing. I said that it was the first time in 6 years, actually the first time in 45 years if we don't have a lease sale. But I would say, look, I don't want a soundbite. I don't want to testify before Congress. I want to go back to Houston and put my workers back to work, and I want to drill for oil and gas. I'm not out to blame anybody, but I will say that if you let me go drill for oil and gas, I'm going to produce more, and that'll impact gasoline prices.
Mr. Massey?
My focus today really should be on the Marine Well Containment Company. I can say that our members have permits in, and if they're allowed to drill and those wells are successful, that's new production, and new production is good.
Thank you, Mr. No. The President Obama last week said, "I'll go anywhere, anytime to be a booster for American businesses, American workers, and American products." In your opinion, does domestic energy development boost American businesses, American workers, and American products?
Absolutely, and not just oil workers. As we mentioned, it's the hard hat manufacturer in Pennsylvania. It's the steel-toe boot manufacturer in Red Wing, Minnesota. This is a nationwide economic tragedy that's occurring.
This time, I recognize the gentleman from West Virginia, Mr. McKinley, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Cooper, can you tell me a little bit, this is the first opportunity I've had to talk to someone about the CAFE standards. What happens to a manufacturer who does not meet those standards? Are they fined?
In the past, they have been fined, but it turns out they haven't frequently paid fines. They've been excused from fines. But that is part of the program, as the incentive to meet the standard is to pay the fine, and therefore it's
okay,
better to meet the standard.
I was suspicious that they were fined, whether they paid them or not, or however they worked out with those things. But what I don't understand is, from the free market, if your statistics were correct, that people want cars to have 60 miles per gallon, why aren't they manufacturing them then? And why is it that the federal government is going to step in and say, we know better than the public? If the public really wanted cars at 60 miles, can't they buy them?
Well, in point of fact, the supply side of the automobile market is not perfect. And so you had American manufacturers who completely missed the shift in demand, and they kept manufacturing gas guzzlers because their rate of profit internally is higher on gas guzzlers than it is on efficient cars. And now, having gone through bankruptcy, GM has reproduced itself, recreated itself as an efficiency-oriented company. They've said they will meet the 60 mile per gallon. Toyota has said they will meet the 60 mile per gallon. So a standard, here's what a standard does. It takes the risk out of investing in those technologies, because they now know.
I'm going to be, if I could recover here some time on it, I like the idea of having cars they have 60 miles, but I think that should be my choice as a consumer and not the federal government. Honestly, I tell you, I can't find anything in here, in the Constitution, that allows us this right to tell the public or tell the manufacturers. Can you share with me what section of the Constitution, where would I find that in there that says we're going to set the standards for automobiles?
Well, as interpreted by the courts, for at least in the case of fuel economy standards, for 40 years.
Could you just get back to me on that if you don't
I'll be glad to give you the legal
like
history
to know
of why it is that the government can protect the American people. So now every time you consume a barrel of oil, you're sending a troop to the Middle East.
60 mile per gallon car, but you're going to put more people at risk, because you know very well that individuals that are injured, that are in impact accidents in smaller vehicles to achieve your ideologically driven motivation is more highly likely to be injured in an accident. So
Absolutely not.
You know that.
Absolutely not. This standard does not require rate reduction, and if it did require weight reduction, it would be with high-strength materials. Science has produced much stronger materials that weigh less. So there is absolutely no reason to believe that is the case.
You're not denying that there are more injuries in smaller cars. Is that what you're trying to tell us, this panel, that you're safer in a small car to get? You're saying
today,
your priority is to getting gas mileage rather than for the safety of your children.
With airbags, you're safer in a smaller car today than you were in a bigger car 30 years ago. With seat belts, which the industry never gave us, let's talk about seat belts. Now, there's a government program that infringed your freedom to sit in a car without a seatbelt and impose all kinds of costs. Are you against seatbelts? Absolutely not. There are millions of Americans alive today because the government decided that seatbelts and airbags were good for you.
I just look forward to you telling me where this section is.
You didn't know well enough. You didn't know enough to know that you needed a seatbelt or an airbag. So we helped you out.
Gentleman yields back
this time. Think about it. Tell your constituents that they really should be in cars without those safety features. The industry never gave us those.
At least
the regulation did.
At least we have some enthusiastic witnesses, here, which I think is important.
Mr. Chairman, and I think it's been our practice that the witness should be allowed to answer the question. So you cut him off in the middle of his answer.
Oh, Dr. Cooper, do you want to make another statement?
No, that's obviously there's a philosophical difference here, and I got millions of live people who are actually better off because we told them to wear seatbelts.
Well, we want to have lively hearings, and we appreciate your being here. Now, Mr. Daniels, it's my understanding that as much as you don't want to leave, you need to leave. So we'll excuse you. We do thank you for joining us, and we look forward to being in touch with you more on these issues. Thanks for attending the hearing.
Thank you.
This time I recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Olson, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for coming today and giving us your expertise. And I promise I'm not going to have some of the fireworks that my colleague from West Virginia had, because I'm not going to talk about or ask questions about CAFE standards. I want to get back to the Gulf. And I'm going to ask you basically 3 questions. The first one is kind of when do you think this economic nightmare is going to end? We've had a moratorium that supposedly the court threw out that was lifted, replaced by a permatorium. And in my opinion, the industry, this was a great safety record, 20 years out there drilling the deep water. And, largest oil spill in American history, I grant that, and the industries responded as best they could. I mean, one thing that, the industry did all by themselves, and Mr. Massey, I think you are somewhere down at the bottom of this picture, but this was industry-driven solution to the problems we encountered in April with the well, the Macondo well. And again, one thing we can't get a handle on here is what's really happening out there in the Gulf. And so the question I have for probably you, Mr. Noe, Mr. Adams, and Mr. Massey is how many rigs, how many deep water rigs have left the Gulf as of today?
Congressman, there's been, I believe, 12 rigs that have left the Gulf since April. And others that are negotiating contracts, long-term contracts outside the Gulf of Mexico. In May of 2010, there were 25 floating rigs and 39 shallow water jackup rigs actively working in the Gulf of Mexico. By January of this year, only 8 floating rigs and 27 shallow water rigs were actively employed in Gulf of Mexico activities. So rigs are in fact idle, and either idled in the Gulf of Mexico and have laid off their crew, or like Hercules, are keeping their crew on the payroll despite the fact that the rigs aren't working, and then you've seen other rigs leave the Gulf of Mexico entirely.
And sir, we've had 60 highly technically capable offshore vessels leave the Gulf of Mexico for foreign operations.
So basically taking American jobs overseas and increasing our dependence upon foreign oil.
In the case of the vessels, that's 1,100 U.S. jobs for those vessels, and those jobs, as they enter into foreign markets, will, by the requirement of most countries, be replaced with foreign nationals.
And Congressman, I would add that when rigs leave, it has a cascading negative impact on America. First, obviously, the rig is no longer available to produce domestic sources of oil and natural gas. The jobs leave with the rigs. The tax revenue that's generated from the economic activity associated with those rigs leaves as well. And then we can't forget the fact that we spend nearly $1 billion each and every day on buying oil from foreign sources, from the Middle East, from North Africa, almost $1 billion a day. And so when those rigs leave, they'll go produce oil and gas in some far-flung land, and we're just going to buy it back and give it to some potentially hostile regime to put it on a tanker and to float it up into our ports.
Again, less American jobs, more dependence upon foreign oil. One last question. This is about more about the jobs. And Mr. Adams, I want to say that I've heard a testimony specifically to what you're talking about the small companies and what they're doing to carry on. And I think Mr. Scalise was with me there, and Dr. Mason was there. We went down to New Orleans in August, I believe it was, Steve. And we had a woman who she was the president of a boat company that was going back and forth to the rigs, about 30 employees. We asked her, how are you getting by? And she said, well, I've had to cut the pay of 2 of my people, herself and her husband. They were taking nothing to carry the rest of their people as long as they could until this moratorium got lifted. Dr. Mason, this question's for you. The administration, I've seen estimates they did about the job loss at somewhere in the 22, somewhere under 30,000 jobs across the country. And I know you've done some research that indicates that that's just a drop in the bucket. It's much more than that with you take all the indirect costs, just not throughout the Gulf Coast, but throughout our entire nation. And I wonder if you could elaborate more on the job costs. I mean, not just happen now, the direct jobs, but what's going to happen in the future and how it's going to impact our economy negatively.
Well, thank you. First, I'd like to point out that the administration's estimates were, for no explainable reason and no empirically justifiable reason, cut in half to reach their final numbers. They've never explained that. They've never defended it. But knowing what I know about the methodology, I know there's no reason for it either. The losses continue to mount. They just continue to build. And as others have pointed out, these losses are to the nation. The drilling pipe comes from steel mills in Ohio, Indiana, around the Chicago area where I grew up. All those materials come from throughout the nation. We are an integrated economy. It is an economic fact that if you raise costs for businesses, there will be less production. But it appears that with respect to your first question, Mr. Olson, when will this end? I hate to say it, but I think it goes far beyond energy and oil and gas. I think that it is a far-reaching problem throughout regulatory agencies. We have the example of the EPA regulating carbon, which is still challenged as whether it's within their authority. The EPA previously regulated phthalates in a similar way with a permatorium. This is nothing new. They did both without any economic impact studies whatsoever. The EPA hasn't conducted an economic impact study in decades. We're going after the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is now trying to regulate foreclosures backdoor through a settlement. And so, BOEMRE is just following in the footsteps of other agencies and I guess doing what modern agencies do. And unless we're ready to constrain regulatory agencies in their activities to affect economic growth kind of willy-nilly, well, we're going to have the same yanking around.
Thank you, Dr. Mason. Mr. Chairman, if I can yield back, no time, I yield it back. Thank you.
You did a good job at that. Thanks. This time, recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Bill Bray, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Mr. Cooper, do you think there's any short-term or long-term benefit for America opening up more public lands for oil exploration and exploitation?
Consumer Federation is a consumer group. We don't deal with environmental questions. I believe that supply can help. Unfortunately, it becomes a distraction, not a solution. So the potential contribution on the demand side.
Would you agree that research and development of second-generation green fuels would be beneficial for long-term approach to the energy issues?
Supply side can help us lower. Well, it probably won't affect the world price of oil.
I'm not talking about supply and independence.
It will create domestic sources of supply.
Okay, and then let me give you 2 scenarios. We today are exporting billions and billions of dollars to the third world by buying oil overseas, while we have oil potentials within our own boundaries. What if I propose to you that this Congress passes a law that any new areas open up for oil exploration will have those revenues or a portion of those revenues committed to a fund, much like what we've done with interstate freeways, and that is have a committed fund directly for a certain purpose. And what I would propose to you is, what would be your reaction to a piece of legislation that said we will now open up public lands for exploration with the funds, profits from that being dedicated to next generation green fuels. So rather than our money going overseas to third world countries, it may go into the United States, but a large portion or a portion of it will be set aside to develop those next generation fuels.
We firmly believe in compromise, pragmatic legislation.
Well,
I would bargain for a firm commitment to a much higher fuel economy standard, because that will do us a lot more. But we will certainly look at, and my resolutions don't oppose that. We really want to make sure we use the royalties well.
Well, the fact is, sir, if we went to diesel, you know those numbers, and you saw what happened in the 70s. I was a member of the Air Resources Board, so I've watched this stuff. I was a member of the the ARB in California, so I've watched this thing go. The fact is, though, we could get better mileage, but the fact is diesel is a toxic emission mega times over what dioxin is. So a lot of these things have offsets that we've got to look at. But my question, again, is the fact that we have these options that we can develop it. You were talking about the CAFE standards. Are you aware that the CAFE standards are set with 100% fossil fuel as the fuel being used to set those standards?
Going forward, we are incorporating other fuels in there. So we clearly have a...
Whoa.
We have a flexible fuel offset in the current standards. We are looking at how to deal with electric vehicles in the future.
Okay. Let me clarify. Right now, EPA tells me, as they always have, they're using fossil fuels 100%, even though that is illegal in the United States. No consumer in America has the right to buy fuel for his system that is 100% fossil fuels. That is not an option for consumers today, but the federal government continues to use that in their standards.
The standard clearly has an offset for flexible fuel vehicles, which actually assumes...
I'm not talking flexible fuel. I'm talking about the fact that you're mandated to put ethanol in your fuel today. Nobody can sell gasoline without ethanol. Ethanol has only 70% of the carbon chain, and you do agree that ethanol is a mileage-robbing additive into our fuel system.
Actually, the jury is out on what it does to mileage because of the way it affects knocking and efficient
What is
burning.
that, Mr. Coe? You're telling me, you're telling me as an expert in this that you feel that ethanol gives the same mileage as gasoline does?
No, I've seen evidence on both sides of that, but it is absolutely...
I would be, before you go any further, I would be very interested, sir.
Okay,
I'll
submit that.
I'm telling you, in the 6 years at ARB, we knew that this was a problem in California in 1992 when the feds were looking at this. I've watched this issue go over. Now, I'll just say this. When you get to the mileage, that additive, we now have laws in this country that says if you have alcohol, if you use ethanol, you get the tax write-off, you get the mandate, you get subsidized. But if you come in with green fuel, algae fuel...
Regularly, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. I'm just asking, do you think it's fair that we're giving ethanol priority for mileage?
Well, clearly, if you produce a flexible fuel vehicle, you get to assume that it always runs on the flexible fuel, which is a tremendous benefit under the standard.
Mr. Chairman, let me clarify. We're not talking flexible fuel. We're talking...
Regular order, Mr. Chairman.
Ethanol
Mr.
is
Rush, I'm going to
flexible
let
fuel.
these two continue their explanation. Hold it a minute. Now, what were you saying?
I would ask for a unanimous consent for one more minute, please.
All right. We have a unanimous consent request for one additional minute.
Sir, you got to understand, I'm not talking flexible.
Wait a minute, Mr. Rayburn.
Okay, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, I don't want to object, but let's make it 1 minute. This has been back and forth for an enormous amount of time.
All right. Mr. Bilbray has 1 minute, and Dr. Cooper.
Mr. Cooper, I was trying to clarify. We're not talking flex fuel. We're talking every automobile that burns gasoline is required to have ethanol in its mix. We're trying now to go to second generation, but the laws, the tax laws, the mandates, and everything else do not give next generation fuels the same tax breaks that corn ethanol is getting today. Do you think we should continue to maintain the subsidy for first generation, which you and I know was always supposed to be abandoned and moved to 2, and do you think we should abandon that system we have now and allow second generation the same tax breaks and same opportunities to replace first generation?
the Consumer Federation has in fact supported and underscored the importance of the second generation. So I am perfectly happy with that approach. We believe that the second generation will produce a much more environmental.
Even though they don't get the tax cuts now.
Well, there's lots of things we would fix in the tax law, make no mistake about it.
Okay, time's expired, and Dr. Cooper, you and Mr. Bilbray can meet outside and finish this discussion if you'd like to. And,
he believes in it as strongly as I do.
I know. But, and I think you had agreed to provide some additional information, and the committee will get back for those of you who committed to provide additional information. So this concludes this hearing, and the record will remain open for 10 days for additional materials and statements. And with that, we thank you very much for your time, for the information that you provided, and look forward to seeing all of you again soon. Hearing's adjourned.